Is my political panel, James Paterson and Tim Watts from our Melbourne studio. Gentlemen, thanks both for your time. I might start with you, James Paterson, around Bridget McKenzie. So the latest revelation, $36,000 to a gun club she was a member of but did not declare it. Should she have?
Tom, I've just seen that story this morning and I don't have any more information on it other than what was written in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. What I understand, though, is from Bridget McKenzie's office is that the membership was a gift and it was below the disclosure threshold, and that's why it didn't appear on her register of interests.
But she could have still declared it in this process before awarding a grant. You also mentioned it's a gift. Well, that can look even worse, can't it? Because you get a free membership and then you also award that same club taxpayer money.
Well, Tom, you probably know this, but for the benefit of the viewers, there are two kinds of declarations that politicians make. If you're a backbencher, you have a parliamentary declaration, which is a public register of your interests, which you need to do. And ministers also have an additional obligation to make disclosures within government of potential conflicts of interest, and that's not a public register. So I don't know what's on Bridget McKenzie's ministerial declaration of interests. That's an internal government matter, and that's used to resolve conflicts in cabinet, for example, as they arise. But what we do know is what's on a public register, and we do know what's required to be on a public register, and this wouldn't have met that threshold. It's certainly the case that some politicians put more than is required on the public register. That's a matter for them.
Yeah. But when Bridget McKenzie was asked about this, the same response I was looking at, she didn't say whether it was declared, and that internal one the public never gets to see. Do we need to find out, given this story, whether or not she made it clear she was a member of the club she gave taxpayer-funded money to? We can find that out. She can tell us.
Well, the other thing we don't know, Tom, is whether or not Sport Australia recommended this particular grant. That might well be the case. The criticism of the minister in this case is that that some clubs received funding that were lower down on the list of recommendations from Sport Australia. We don't know. I don't have the full details of this.
So should we find that out? We need transparency then? It sounds like you agree.
Well, I think even the ANAO in their report, I think they didn't list all the clubs that were eligible and not eligible, or received or didn't receive funding, Tom. So really, I think if the ANAO is being cautious in that, I think the government should be too.
But what stops the government now, or Bridget McKenzie, from saying, here are all the details around this particular grant? Surely they can release that.
Well, that's a matter for her office and her as a minister. But the good
I'm
news
asking
is,
if
Tom,
you think she should.
Yeah, I don't have a strong view either way, Tom. That's really a matter for her whether she thinks that's appropriate.
You don't have a view?
No, that's what I just said.
Okay. Tim Watts, your thoughts?
Tom, where to begin? Like, this is just a roll gold scandal, and every day we see more flagrant breaches of proper process. Look, I've got to take issue with what James said there. On the disclosures that members of parliament have, there is a section for memberships, and that section says you should declare memberships where it could create perception of a conflict of interest. There is a separate process for ministers, that's true, and that is not public, what disclosures are made there. But I certainly disclose memberships that I'm a part of. I disclose memberships that members of my family, that my partner is a part of. This is a well-established process, and this idea that it's just a gift, frankly, it's just the latest in a series of distractions. Bridget McKenzie should have gone days ago. She should have gone days ago. It's not even close, Tom. This just shows that Scott Morrison stands for nothing. There are no ministerial standards in this government. If Bridget McKenzie lasts one more day in this job, Scott Morrison has no standards. I mean, I've got sporting clubs in my electorate that spend hours and hours and hours on these applications, mums and dads over kitchen tables, and they've been dudded by a daggy dad out in a marketing plan.
It's been pointed out, though, as well, that Catherine King approved projects under the Regional Development Fund that the independent panel in that case actually rejected.
Well, Tom, let's get the information out there. I mean, this idea that, oh, both sides do it, that makes it okay, that is rubbish. We know from the ANAO that the minister here, Bridget McKenzie, intervened hundreds of times. Today we learnt that she intervened to give a grant to a club, a shooting club, she was a member of. I mean, the list of these other associations that got grants that MPs are members of, and we see further reporting today. I think it was in the Nine papers.
If she
There's like
intervened,
half a
do we know
dozen
whether
government
the
MPs.
sports agency recommended this grant or not?
Well, Tom, what we do know is that Bridget McKenzie very deliberately said to the Sports Commission, don't send me the reasons for your judgments. Don't send me the reasons for the recommendations that you have about which grants are worthy. I don't want to know about them. I'll make a call myself.
Okay, well,
and
let me
what
just put that
standards was
Catherine
she
King
making that
example
call
for you
on?
again, though. So in this case,
Tom, I wasn't a
clearly
member of that
the
government. I
ANO
know
was
nothing
scathing-
about the Catherine King example. This both sides stuff is crap. We're
Well, let me
dealing
explain
with
it to you
an
very
absolute
clearly then,
scandal
because
at the moment.
in the case of Bridget McKenzie, Tim Watts, it is true that the ANAO was scathing of what she did, and it was clearly about trying to win over marginal seats, but all the projects were eligible. In the case of Catherine King, some of the projects that had money were actually rejected by the panel.
Tom, this idea that everything is okay here with what Bridget McKenzie has done because the projects are eligible. I mean, Tom, let's be frank. The Gold Coast Suns were eligible to win the AFL Premiership last year. Doesn't mean that they deserved it more than the Richmond Tigers. I mean, what
I'm not
a
saying
load
that's okay.
of
I'm
nonsense.
just saying that
Parents in the community, the people that have
this mean Labor's
sacrificed.
got some baggage here as well, Tim Watts, and perhaps you could look at making all these types of grants independent so a future Labor government won't
Tom,
go
there
down
are
the same path it did
existing
previously.
rules. There are existing rules that are in place to ensure that these grants are made in an independent way.
Which were broken by
this
Catherine
government
King as
has
well,
gone out of its way to subvert these rules. The structure of these sporting grants is very deliberately set up to be able to avoid those rules. To the extent where, as I said earlier, they have gone out of their way to say we don't want the reasons. We don't want to know. We don't want to know the merits of these projects. We will make the decision ourselves.
Tom, just very quickly
Okay.
before we move on, just to assist him, because I'm not sure his history is completely up to date with Catherine King. Not only did she preside over a similar program to this one, and not only was she heavily criticised by the ANAO for her administration of it, but she did not resign, she was not sacked, and she remains on Anthony Albanese's front bench today. So, frankly, I doubt the sincerity of Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party in their concern about this issue. If he was really concerned about this, he would sack Catherine King and then he'd be on stronger ground to demand the same of others.
Moving on, Dave Sharma is talking about a high level of ambition on climate change. James Paterson, do you agree?
Yeah, Dave's a valued colleague and I'd also say a friend of mine from before politics, and so I closely listen to what he says on this and other matters. I think we have a high level of ambition within our existing commitments, and we went to the federal election.
Though.
Yeah, we went to the federal election less than 12 months ago, promising a 26 to 28% reduction, and we were re-elected on that basis. So I don't think we should be going beyond a commitment we made to the Australian people less than a year ago.
I want to ask about the 26 to 28 because Scott Morrison has actually gone the other way. The biggest decision he's made was to use carryover credits, a decision he made that was not policy before he came to power, which effectively halved the target. So that's less action.
I don't agree with that, Tom. When you're talking about global emissions reduction, we're talking about a cumulative emissions reduction task over time. We are not talking about a single endpoint at a particular year. So, of course, if you go faster in some years and slower than other years, then you should get credit for all of the work you did over that time, not just the work you did in the later years. So it's entirely appropriate,
Look, you
in
can
my
talk
view,
about
to use
credit
carryover credits.
and I don't even want to talk about appropriateness of carryover credits, but just this undeniable fact. Before he was in power, that 26% target by 2030 was not using carryover. That was not the policy. It was not shadowed anywhere. He made that decision. Regardless of what you say Australia deserves, that target was effectively halved. In terms of what actual emissions go out, don't worry about the agreements, the actual emissions into the atmosphere are going to be more as a result of that decision. That's true, isn't it?
I'm not sure that's right, Tom. I'd have to check that. It's always been an option under the Kyoto Protocol for countries to get credit for the earlier emissions reduction that they achieved. I think that's appropriate.
Not on the Paris commitment.
It's not a new policy.
It was new. This was a new policy announced by Scott Morrison.
Tom, this has been an established part of global climate change negotiation frameworks for decades. It is not new. It was not invented recently. Scott Morrison is not the author of it.
No, I'm not saying it's a new concept. But using that, Australia using that by 2030, that was a decision by the Morrison government.
I'm not sure that's right, Tom. I don't have that in front of me. I'm not sure that's right. I think that the key point, though, Tom, is that it's a accepted part of the international climate change framework. It has been for many years. It is an option and has always been an option for Australia and other countries to utilise it to ensure that we meet and beat our targets, because the important thing as far as the planet's concerned is not a single end point in time, it is our cumulative emissions reduction task over time. So it would be insane
This was
not to
something
count
never
earlier
detailed
emissions
before
reductions that we
December
achieved.
2018, and that was the first time that it was detailed. It was not a policy before then. Can you point to when it was ever announced under Malcolm Turnbull, when it was ever foreshadowed?
That might be right, Tom. As I said, I don't know. I'm not sure that that's right. I don't have that in front of me. But what I'm saying is I think it's a completely uncontroversial, normal part of a climate change policy.
Yeah, okay. Well, perhaps you can clarify that, and we'll talk about it next time. Labor, Tim,
Sure.
what seems to be going the other way in terms of ambition compared to what Dave Sharma says, a target lower than 45% by 2030 appears to be what the ground is being readied for.
Well, Tom, what Anthony Albanese said the other day in an interview on Sky is entirely uncontroversial. There's no new news in it. He's been saying very consistently since the last election that given the result, very disappointing result for the Australian Labor Party, that all our policies would be under review. And we'd take a very deliberate, careful, slow process of reviewing those policies to make sure we get it right, and to make sure that at the next federal election in 2022, we take a policy to the Australian people that is ambitious on climate change, that does respect the science, that does ensure that Australia is playing its role as part of a global response to this extraordinarily serious issue for Australia. He wasn't saying anything new when he said that the policies, the targets we took to the last election were under review. I mean, that's not new news, right? As for the 45% target, that's a target that we adopted before the 2016 election as a 15-year midterm target. Now, by the time we get to the 2022 election, we'll be more than halfway through that 15-year process, that 15-year period for emissions reduction. So, of course, we will look at it again, because we need to see what is achievable in a way that ensures we respect the science, part of an international response, and is possible with the technology in a way that respects and supports Australian
that's the line
jobs.
that people are looking at, the achievable, and perhaps that will be tougher or more expensive to achieve, and that's why it would be changed.
Or it
We'll
might
see.
be cheaper.
Let me ask you this
or
broadly,
it may be a miracle of
Sure.
miracles. The Morrison government might actually do something on climate change, and we start from a more advantageous starting point. I don't expect
Let me
that
ask
to
you
happen,
this,
but
though.
possibly.
The government's essential line on this is that they want to take action on climate change but not hurt the economy, and essentially don't think that there should be any sacrifice on the economy. Do you think Australians are willing to have some sort of sacrifice for climate change, or is it going to need to come from a starting point of don't hurt the economy at all, given what happened in the election not so long ago?
I think the lesson from this summer, Tom, is that climate change itself is an extraordinarily serious threat to the Australian economy. I mean, the disruption and the damage caused by the national bushfire crisis over this summer, not just the destruction in terms of the loss of life and the loss of properties in affected areas, but the disruption throughout the entire economy. I mean, you look at where we are in Melbourne at the moment. We've got the Australian Open on at the moment, a $350 million event, the value for that for the Victorian economy, for the Melbourne economy. If smoke or bushfires or climate change related disasters affected an event like that, I mean, the economic effect of that should be obvious to all. So we have to act on climate change to mitigate the economic costs of this threat.
What are your thoughts on that, James Paterson? Do you agree?
Well, I agree with Anthony Albanese that it was a mistake for the Labor Party to take a 45% emissions reduction target to the last election, which is a new revelation that we've learnt this week, that he believes that. I think he's right. I think that was, as the Business Council of Australia said, an economy-wrecking target. I think Tim's probably hinting in his answer previously that it wouldn't have been technologically feasible, or it certainly wouldn't have been feasible without a severe cost to the economy and to people's jobs. And the reality is Australia does need to take measured, reasonable action in concert with our partners, but there is no advantage in Australia moving faster and ahead of the rest of the world and doing more than the rest of the world at a cost to our own economy and a cost to people's jobs, because Australia doing climate mitigation faster than everyone else is not going to make the climate heal any quicker than everyone else does it. So it's very important that we're measured and consistent with the globe and not ahead of it.
I sense the conversation will be ongoing. Tim Watts, James Paterson, appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Pleasure, Tom.